Today on the Perception and Action podcast, exploring coaches' experiences in using a nonlinear, ecological approach to coaching. What are some of the challenges and best practices? So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Now on to the show. In today's episode, I want to look at one of my favorite topics to look at recently is understanding coaches, their experiences in transitioning from a more traditional, prescriptive form of coaching to an ecological form. And to do this, I want to look at the article titled, Exploring Sports Coaches' Experiences of Using a Contemporary Pedagogical Approach to Coaching, an International Perspective. This article by Stone, Rich Shuttleworth, Keith Davids, that was published a few years ago, but I think it's really useful. In their article, they lay out, of course, what they're talking about, nonlinear pedagogy, ecological approach, talking about how these have been proposed and how some of the challenges in dealing with it. So in their own words, one contemporary nonlinear approach conceptualizes athletes as complex adaptive systems guided by a theoretical framework of ecological dynamics, highlighting the importance of complex dynamic interactions in person-environment relationships. The less predictable outcomes that emerge through dynamic learner-environment interactions within a nonlinear pedagogy-informed pedagogical approach present considerable challenges to practitioners. To successfully coach using principles of nonlinear pedagogy requires practitioners to have a clear understanding of the learning process from an ecological dynamics perspective and excellent observational and analytical skills. Current observation of practice shows that coaches of all levels still require assistance in ensuring that key elements underpinning such contemporary approaches are correctly considered when designing practice tasks. Hence, there is a bias towards continued use of traditional approaches, with sports practitioners struggling to use more contemporary methodologies, instead finding it easier to continue using traditional methods. This appears to result in a disconnection between what empirical research suggests may be a good pedagogical approach and what coaches choose to adopt to do in practice. For example, coaches continue to focus on instructing athletes toward adopting a gold standard movement pattern in comparison to providing learners with opportunities to modify their movement behaviors appropriately in the search for functional coordination solutions. End quote. So this is a lot of the things I've been talking about recently and things that I've seen. I think transitioning, it can be quite difficult. Often it starts with kind of a cut and paste approach. Like I see this constraints activity, I'm just going to copy it. Understanding the principles behind it and how to move from there can be quite difficult. And often you do see people resort back to telling the athletes what to do. In their words, the aim of the study was to explore insights and experiences of coaches who are adopting contemporary theoretical-driven nonlinear pedagogical approaches. Our main aim was to provide coaches with a voice to consider why they have adopted these contemporary methodologies, how they are utilized, and their experiences they faced in this challenge. These insights may help inform future coach education programs and provide practical recommendations to support other coaches to critically evaluate and explore the use of nonlinear contemporary methods in their practice. So this study used a semi-structured interview of 15 professional coaches, right? So they had set questions they asked them when they were discussing the coaches. The coaches were from a range of different countries: Australia, Netherlands, Portugal, Sweden, UK, US, and from a variety of different sports: soccer, rugby, swimming, figure skating, volleyball, golf, field hockey, and other sports. So they had quite a range, quite a good broad sampling of coaches. They're interviewing them. What their questions they were asked were framed around the general background and familiarization with their coaching role, the coaching culture, personal coaching approach. Tell me about the methods you use, experiences that shape their adoption of certain approaches. Why do you use these coaching methods? Experiences and insights using any contemporary pedagogical approaches. How have athletes adapted to these? And recommendations for practice for coaches adopt these approaches. And from this, what they did was a thematic analysis. So they tried to identify common themes across all the answers, right? And the typical approach when you do semi-structured interviews, right? What themes can you pull out? And they identified 59 lower order themes and 10 higher order themes, which were organized across 3 dimensions. So the 3 broad dimensions were factors underpinning the coach's approach to athlete learning, learning approaches, and responses to the contemporary pedagogical approaches, and the more nonlinear one. We still in the lower order ones, you see, still some of the traditional things come out. You see coach-led perfect technique, nonlinear, predictable outcome, change of approach through experience is another one that comes, personal development, leading to accepting there's no one optimal movement, the challenge of unopposed practice, right? So a lot of these kind of common themes, some things I've talked about a long time, parental perspective, right? Parents questioning what you're doing, the responsibility and control of the learner versus the coach, and sticking to the approach, was a common one, despite any challenges, right? So sticking to your approach and focusing on communication. I invite you to have a look at the paper. They give lots of good quotes and examples of this. I just want to kind of give a broad overview. These are some of the themes we've talked about a lot. I mostly want to just focus on the recommendations they give at the end. So the recommendations they give for using this approach from their experience. One of them, a lot of these things are going to sound familiar. Using a conceptualized approach to learning to assist coaches to provide quality experiences for athletes and help guide practice during these approaches. Right? This is something I say all the time. You have to have a theory of learning. Your decisions on how to coach are based on how you think learning and skill acquisition occurs, right? You have to have a framework on which to hang your approaches and your practice design. Number two, and this is something I found, is need for good communication with other stakeholders, as well as to continue to educate themselves and explore varying approaches which align with their adopted learning approach, right? So education of other coaches, of managers, of players, of parents, I think that's really important. It's very, very challenging. I think you need to kind of set it out at the start. And we'll get to this in a second again, right? This experience is obviously based on research, this is kind of an evidence-based approach. So there's kind of as a coach, you want to try to stay up with the evidence. So there's some to keep learning, keep developing. The third kind of recommendation was to stick to a philosophy despite any negative reactions from stakeholders. Okay, this was an expression from a rugby coach. Yeah, don't be put off by sort of constraints from other people. Set your own philosophy, and that's the way you want to coach, that style of coaching. That's what you stick to. It does take some sort of resilience, right? And we've talked about coaches and other players, right? Parents, responses, right? You have to kind of, some of these things are going to take time, right? So you have to let it go. The fourth one, theoretical learning approaches need to be encouraged to ensure the latest fads and trends do not get uncritically adopted. This is something I was just talking about with people the other day. To me, I think we always want to view the new technologies and methods from our lens and our theory of skill, right? Does this fit with our theory? Is this promoting one way to do it, or is it promoting self-organization, exploration, for example? That's one thing I always look at when I look at a new technology. And I think we always want to arm people with this kind of lens so they can do it themselves. Coaches have discussed how they felt it was important not to be bothered what other people think of a learning approach. And you're constantly thinking about it's going to get in the way, going to be this way to suit the person. I've got to assimilate this way. You can't ever listen to that thing, get whatever it is. They also note that they're, as coaches, they're still in the minority. For other less experienced coaches who are likely to have limited power or agency, to go against the currently employed approaches within an organization would constitute a considerable challenge, right? So they recognize standing up and sticking to what you believe. But I think you still have to identify what you believe, right? And stick to it and be, what do you believe is the best, most effective way to learn a skill? What is your framework? What is your theory? And use that as a lens. And, I think this kind of stick-to-itiveness, I think, is important. Fifth, the approach to developing athlete learning needs to be underpinned by contemporary evidence, emphasizing the importance of engaging with ongoing research during professional practice. I would definitely want them to stay in touch with motor learning and performance research, because doing that, they will not get lost. It might be a bit difficult to read if you're not an academic, and I would say don't be quick to jump to conclusions, right? So this is something I've kind of emphasized too, right? We want to stay in touch with the literature, take things out of it that are useful for us, but not use it verbatim, right? Obviously, a lot of the conditions studied in research studies are not exactly fitting sport. Number 6, many coaches highlighted that it will take time and failure is part of the process, but such experiences do not prevent a coach from exploring the uses of innovative approaches. Interviewees also explained the need to be flexible in a coaching approach which will enable innovative and effective training that supports individuals to learn. Flexibility, that word gets a little bit scary because that sounds like you can switch your theory and your framework as you need. I don't think that's what they're trying to say. Flexibility in terms of methodologies, not principles. That's where I want to be. Flexibility in terms of constraints, right? If this constraint doesn't work, try something else. But principles, I think we want to stick hard and fast to. Last one, coaches discuss how coaches with a multidisciplinary background with experiences in a range of sports tend to have a better understanding of contemporary approaches, and that young coaches should gain experience in a range of sports. But what I find interesting is that coaches have a cross-sport experience have a much easier time of understanding it, that is contemporary nonlinear approaches. I've seen this too. I think it really, coaches that are willing to try to understand what's going on in other sports and takes lessons from other sports, I think it's just an openness. I think they see kind of the commonalities, the principles, again, focusing on a principle, a theory of learning, rather than focusing on this specific thing for your sport. So overall, I think this is a really interesting article that addresses a lot of things we've talked about in the podcast. So, this is something I'm really interested in, how coaches can become an ecologically based coach. All the steps involved, what kind of support, the education, the continued education, and so on. So I hope you'll have a look at this article, and that's it for now. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including a monthly coaches meetup, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em couple. Gone through St. Louis.